The Cold War from a Soviet perspective. My question is, in the perspective of the Soviet Union, how did the beliefs of the people and the government change from the beginning of the Cold War up to the fall of the Soviet Union? With this, my thesis is, the beginning of the Cold War was fueled by a sense of nationalism, but towards the end of the Cold War, this sense of nationalism fell, along with the Soviet Union. Some may say that this is due to Khrushchev's rule, but it is clear that Khrushchev only uncovered the true beliefs of the people, that they do not want to be enemies with the U.S., while Stalin actually used nationalism to suppress the people's belief. Therefore, nationalism is a dangerous weapon and must not grow too powerful in any country. Ivan Alexandrovich Bukvaryov. My great-grandfather, Ivan Alexandrovich Bukvaryov, participated in the Second World War, fighting against fascist Germany from 1941 to 1945. He was born in 1914. He studied at Leningrad Financial Academy and served as a financial worker in the war. He finished the war in May 1945 in East Prussia. He has many military awards, including orders and medals. After the victory over Germany, he participated in military operations in Manchuria and Korea. After that, he served in troops for the Soviet Army in Germany to stop the revival of fascism in the world. He died from cancer in 1977. Something that held communism together in the Soviet Union was a collective hate towards other countries as a form of nationalism. My great-grandfather, for example, was driven by his resentment towards fascist Germany to participate in all of these military operations for the Soviet Union. Another example is the growth of anti-American beliefs that further fueled the sense of nationalism in the Soviet Union. The rise of the anti-American movement. From the very beginning of the Cold War, nationalism in the Soviet Union was fueled by Soviet supremacy and negative collective opinions of other nations. The anti-American movement was a mass hatred towards the U.S. and its culture, which began from Stalin himself, who started an anti-American campaign that spread throughout the entire Soviet Union. Soviet authorities feared that the consumption of American culture would lead to the Soviet Union being viewed in a lesser light than the U.S., so they implemented anti-American laws and campaigns and blocked outside media such as radio broadcasts, news articles, and television. Article 5810 of the Soviet Criminal Code threatened to imprison or sentence to death those who had any sentiments of overthrowing the Soviet Union. People who were accused of having pro-American beliefs, whether they listened to enemy radio broadcasts or doubted Soviet supremacy, were sentenced by this code. Towards the end of Stalin's rule, Soviet revolutionaries also spread the anti-American campaign through media such as literature, the arts, and journalism. Even Russian history textbooks aimed at school children described the U.S. in a negative light. This sense of fear amongst the people forced them to despise the U.S., despite what they might have felt like on the inside. And the fall of the anti-American movement. After Stalin's death and Khrushchev's coming to power, these anti-American beliefs faded. Khrushchev celebrated the Soviet-U.S. wartime alliance and even received a lot of positive feedback from Soviet citizens, such as letters wishing him well and advocating for a better relationship with the U.S. The happiness of the people showed that this is the outcome that they truly wanted. As people came to learn more about the outside world and the U.S., they started to become confused and even doubtful of the Soviets' relationship with the U.S. Russian history textbooks also shifted criticism from the U.S. to the Soviet Union itself. However, it was still taboo for Soviet citizens to view the U.S. with too much interest until the fall of the Soviet Union. And with the fall of the Soviet Union, people began to idealize the U.S. and joyfully consume American media, which goes to show that maybe that's what they really wanted. Interviews. So I conducted interviews with Russian people I know and asked them these following 2 questions. Number 1, what do you know about the Cold War? Number 2, what is your stance on the Cold War? I started with an adult who was born in the Soviet Union in 1949, and this was an in-person interview. They said that the Cold War continued after World War II between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Cold War is a war without combat. It is a cultural, ideological, and social affair. The Cold War ended when the Soviet Union fell, and that was to answer what they knew about the Cold War. And their stance on the Cold War is, I have a negative opinion about the Cold War because the population is disappointed about another country, and the cultural and social revelation within countries were very weak. Countries formed enemies and then spent a lot of money on the military. Russians couldn't move to other countries freely. So here I interviewed another adult who was born in the Soviet Union in 1980 through text message. What they know about the Soviet Union. I don't remember the details. When I was studying it, it was in the 90s right after the USSR collapsed. So it was still allowed to talk and teach about it openly, but I was not paying attention to the details. And I think I'm gonna skip through that and go to kind of stance / what they know about the Cold War. I only lived about the first 10.5 years of my childhood life in the Soviet Union, so I don't have any grown-up experience there. My parents and grandparents were watching TV and reading newspapers, but to me it was all noise. All I wanted was another school break. So now I can only guess that based on some knowledge of the average people's mindset. Even my parents and grandparents have never met top officials in person and never knew exactly what was in their minds. So the government perspective is a speculative thing. What they've been feeding to people in the news may have nothing to do with what they've been thinking. So now we can only talk about who believed TV and who did not, and the answer depends at what time exactly. Some events of the early to mid-80s, such as the Afghanistan war and Chernobyl, made many changes to their trust and mistrust. And I think that the Cold War with its Iron Curtain kept the population from massive immigration that could have weakened the country, and it would have collapsed much earlier than it did. I would also draw similarity with Confederate slave owners. Without slavery, their inefficient businesses become unprofitable. So the Soviet government looked at the working population like slaves in a sense. Here's another adult born in the Soviet Union in 1983, again interviewed through text message, a lot shorter. They said that I don't know anything. When I was born, it was over about the Cold War. So I asked, what did you learn about in school? And they also said, we didn't learn about the Cold War. When I was in school, I didn't even know there was such a thing. So I asked what they know about it now. They said there was tension between two countries, some political, some economic. Also, a lot of people were afraid that a real war was about to start. So here I interviewed a classmate of mine who went to Madison Russian School with me. They were born in the US in 2006 and visit Russia often. So what they know about the Cold War. They said, so the Cold War was a conflict between the USSR and the US. It sparked because of the growing tensions between two nations over the issue of communism. Space race was part of the Cold War as both countries saw space as a way to demonstrate superiority to one another. Also, there were concerns about national security and a growing fear of the nuclear bomb. And I asked them to elaborate on their stance on the Cold War. They said, okay, so my stance is, I think that the USSR had better technology and they won the space race because they went to space first, not gonna lie. I know that Apollo landed on the moon or whatever, but I feel like that's not as cool as what the USSR did. USSR literally sent the Sputnik into space, and also Gagarin was the first guy in space, which is kind of cool. Also, literally, the USSR wouldn't drop the bomb because the US also had a bomb, so it was stupid to worry about. Also, the US literally did it to Japan, so it would only be fair if the USSR did it to them. Okay, that's spicy. So, the conclusion. These interviews taught me that knowledge and stance on the Cold War indeed varies between different age groups and what country they received education from. Ironically enough, with these interviews, the oldest individual who lived through the Cold War was nearly critical of the Soviet Union, while the youngest individual almost held a sense of nationalism from the Soviet Union based on the Cold War, although they had never lived through it. This goes to show that how those who lived through the Cold War do not want to live through something similar again, and do not want to hold resentment towards the US for this reason. Also, in the present day, with the access to the internet, knowledge is purely based on personal interest or type of education received, as shown through these interviews. Overall, the sense of nationalism in the Soviet Union did not hold it together forever. The beliefs of the people, such as their wishes to have a good relationship with the US, were revealed when Khrushchev came to power and stopped suppressing media so much. To this day, while again Russian people may grow resentment towards the US with current world affairs, it is most likely still true that the people truly wish to have a good relationship with the US, despite the government again disliking the US. And here are some links from the pictures I used.